This is Live at the Hall from the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. This week, a performance and conversation with fiddler Laura Jane Houle and the museum's Patrick Huber about some of the earliest recordings of country music, made in 1922 by Henry Gilliland and Eck Robertson.
100 years ago this past June, two champion fiddlers from the Southwest strolled into the New York City studios of the Victor Talking Machine Company, the largest and most prestigious record manufacturer in America. The duo had traveled to the city earlier that week by train after entertaining at a United Confederate Veterans reunion in Richmond, Virginia. While their clothing might have been appropriate for the Confederate Veterans reunion event, the fiddlers must have drawn strange looks on the streets of jazz-age Manhattan. One of them, a 34-year-old Texan, was dressed in his cowboy stage costume, and the other, a 77-year-old Oklahoma resident, was dressed in his actual Confederate Army uniform. Their names were Eck Robertson and Henry Gilliland, and they had arrived, they informed Victor officials, for a recording audition. Victor studio officials were struck by their unusual outfits, but were unimpressed by the fiddlers themselves, at least initially. Then Robertson struck into his signature contest tune, Sally Gooden. Well, I didn't get to play half of Sally Gooden, Robertson recalled decades later, before the record manager throwed up his hands and stopped me. Said, "Bye, Ned, that's fine," and just smiled, you know. The next day, at the recording manager's invitation, Robertson and Gilliland recorded a series of old-time fiddling tunes that are now widely considered the first commercial recordings of country music. As a Victor press release put it at the time, for the first time, real old fiddlers' music has been given recognition as an art. Today, we have a special guest to help us make sense of Robertson and Gilliland's 1922 sessions and to discuss the most famous recording to come out of them, Sally Gooden. Our guest has graciously agreed to teach us all about fiddling, or at least to try gamely, and furthermore, to answer all the questions that we might have about fiddling, but we're afraid to ask. I can promise you that, if it's possible, you'll leave here with a newfound understanding of and appreciation for fiddle music. Laura Jane Houle is an ideal person to guide us on this historical and musical journey because she's not only a professional country fiddler, having toured previously with the band Flatland Cavalry, but she's also a classically trained violinist. What's more, she's a native of Eck Robertson's adopted state of Texas, and to top it all off, in 2014, she completed a master's thesis in musicology at Texas Tech University titled Carrying on the Tradition, a performance practice analysis of the stylistic evolution of Texas contest-style fiddling. One of the principal figures she wrote about was Eck Robertson. Please join me in welcoming Laura Jane Houle to the stage. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for traveling, for coming here and being our guide on this special day to commemorate Robertson and Gilliland sessions.
Thank you so much for having me and the museum for having me. I'm honored to be able to talk about this such a seminal record and celebrate 100 years since this fiddle record came out.
Well, I wanted to start off by asking you how you got interested in Eck Robertson. I think that's the place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I was a weird kid. I loved like Roy Rogers, any kind of singing cowboy. My parents had horses, so I would literally go ride around and sing old cowboy tunes. And then I loved fiddle music too. And my dad got me a bunch of transcription books because I was trained classically. And I learned songs better by reading the notation rather than the oral tradition, which is more typical for fiddle music. And came across Mark O'Connor's transcriptions, and he talked about Eck Robertson, and I kind of got into it, and I was like, wow, this guy is such a character. He wrote, played the first country music record, but also the mythology surrounding this man. I mean, if he was a promoter nowadays, everyone should be famous. They would be in all the newspapers as the greatest musician in the world. And I was just automatically struck, and then when I went to school, I realized, wow, I could write papers about this. I could actually get a degree studying the music I love.
And Gilliland in a lot of histories gets short shrift. Eck Robertson is the one who is usually mentioned. Gilliland is sort of the Robin to Robertson's Batman, but we shouldn't overlook him because he's a colorful figure and interesting in his own right.
Oh, absolutely agree. He won a ton of fiddle competitions in his own right, but he was older by the time they actually put out the record. He was, 78? Yeah. And Robertson was, a young buck in his 20s. And so I think if Gilliland had more opportunity to record, that maybe his name would be just as known. But upon his passing, he was also noticed as the world's greatest fiddler. So was Eck. It's on his tombstone that he's the world's greatest fiddler as well.
He was his own best publicist.
Yes.
And Gilliland, we should note, is the oldest known Southern fiddler the earliest born, I should say, Southern fiddler known to record, and also one of the oldest at the time that he did record.
It's interesting, I love the story of these two men in their outfits in Jazz A's, Gatsby's, New York, just strolling down the street asking for a recording contract. But I think it's important to note, just like now, we need contacts. And it's interesting, Gilliland was the one that had the contact. He knew a lawyer with Victor Records, now RCA, and so they were able to get him in the door to have the audition. But I prefer the story that they just strolled in. They're like, we're here to record some tunes.
So why, 100 years after these recordings were made, why do we still remember Robertson?
His Sally Gooden is a landmark Sally Gooden, and if it's because it was the first one recorded, and so people were able to learn off of that tradition, possibly, but what he's able to do with just a very simple melody is extraordinary. When you go to contests today, you still hear echoes of Eck Robertson's variations and melodic tunes in the contests today.
And we'll talk more about that as well. I wanted to get you, in your thesis, Laura, you interpret or read this particular photograph, which is an iconic image of Robertson. And could you talk a little bit about what this photo says to you or says about him?
Absolutely.
To you?
Yeah. So when I look at this photo, it's very much Eck Robertson's persona, that cowboy persona. He's like, some of his quotes, oh, hell, I'm the best fiddler around, And so he's in his cowboy garb. But what's interesting is this iconic image has withstood the test of time. So it was not only used for his promotional materials, for his records, but even most recently, almost 50 years later, it was the cover of a book, The Devil's Box, The Masters of Southern Fiddling by Charles Wolfe. And so this image is still being chosen to represent all-encompassing fiddle players even today.
And he lived long enough, as Laura pointed out, he died in 1975 at the age of 87. He lived long enough to where he could be rediscovered by folklorists and by urban folk revivalists and really become a darling of the urban folk revival and tell his story, right, and promote himself. And that also plays into his mythology.
The fact that Eck Robertson was at the Newport Folk Festival with Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul, and Mary is still amazing to me. I wish I'd been born to see that.
In 1965,
yeah.
when Dylan went electric.
Yep.
Well, the recordings themselves, some of you may be wondering why they are the first commercial recordings of country music. I mean, what makes them that? But before we answer that, maybe we should listen to a little bit of one of the recordings again, just to remind you all of what they sounded like. And this is a duet between Gilliland and Robertson. most of you is Turkey in the Straw. And as you saw on Friday, June 30th, the duo did a series of 4 duets together, and then on Saturday, the following day, July 1st, 1922, Robertson came back by himself and performed 6 solos. But why are these, Laura, considered the first recordings of country music?
I think largely because they practiced in the tradition. They grew up, playing barn dances. They're authentic in that style of music. And so we have the very first people that, played that style of music, being recorded in history. And so I think that withstands the test of time, even if those weren't as popular as, say, some of the other recordings later down the line that sold more copies. The fact that they made this decision that, no, this music needs to be recorded, it needs to be populated to the United States, was remarkable.
We should point out that this isn't settled fact, though, by any stretch of the imagination, that there are other contenders and other scholars who claim that other recordings were the first. As you saw on that slide, one dating all the way back to 1916. But that's not to diminish what Robertson and Gilliland accomplished, because there's certainly an early milestone in the development of the modern country music recording industry. So the most famous tune to come out of the sessions is Sally Gooden, which you talked about a little bit. Can you say a little bit more about Sally Gooden? Because that's one of the key tunes that you analyzed in your thesis.
Yeah, it's a classic breakdown, and a breakdown or a hoedown means it's basically used for dancing. It's usually 2/4 time or 4/4 time, but it's upbeat so people can clog and dance along to it. And it does have lyrics to it, but typically when these fiddlers played, they didn't want to pollute their music with lyrics. No, it's a true quote from Robertson. But what's interesting is Robertson actually told the story of Sally Gooden before he would play, normally live. He would tell the story how Sally Gooden was a farmer, she lived on a farm, and he would try to mimic all these different animals that were on her farm within his tunes. And so it was interesting to kind of listen to some of the variations, and it's like, well, is he trying to be an animal there? And we'll hear one where he's kind of doing like a turkey call, but he was known for his just like showmanship and trying to entertain the audience that way. But this song has 13 variations, but he kind of segments it a little bit into 20 segments. And like I said earlier, we still hear these variations in contests today. Mark O'Connor, amazing fiddler, you hear echoes of this very recording.
Could we pull up the page from Laura's master's thesis? I wanted to show the audience the analysis, the deconstruction that she did on Sally Gooden, which for me just opened up the tune and helped me to understand why this is such a masterpiece. The great country music discographer and scholar Tony Russell wrote about Sally Gooden. He said, "It's not just good for its time, it's great for all time. A small but perfect masterpiece of American music." And I love that about it. And I hope today when you leave here, you will also appreciate that fact as well. And so, in order to understand what Eck Robertson is doing here with all of the variations, why don't you tell us what a variation is, just so that we're all on the same page?
So a variation is any kind of adornment to a melody. These tunes were very, very simple. Like I said, they usually had lyrics to them. So they're just a simple old-time melody that you would hear, usually an A-B section, meaning one section and then the other section is different, usually repeating. And so what Eck does in this is he changes the melody by adding different ornamentation, such as double stops, 2 notes played at the same time. He adds little triplets, trills to make the additions, as well as playing with rhythmic and where he plays on the instrument to get a different sonic sound. So he, unlike most fiddlers, he goes up the neck. A lot of fiddlers just stayed in the first position instead of moving all around the instrument to get the different tonalities.
And so we can begin to understand a little bit about how complex this particular arrangement is and what he's doing here. Would you play Sally Gooden unadorned and in its most simplistic
Absolutely.
form?
So I'll play the A and the B section of Unadorned Sally Gooden.
So here is Eck Robertson's 1922 recording of Sally Gooden. So it's great to have you here to guide us through this particular tune and deconstruct it and teach us how or why this is such a masterpiece of American music.
Absolutely. So for this one, to kind of like deconstruct it, I took actually a classical music theorist by Henry Schenker. It's called Schenkerian analysis. And basically what that large word means is they want to deconstruct the tune to 3 notes. This theorist's idea was you could deconstruct every single tune to just 3 blind mice. I mean, talk about like a Bach partita, Beethoven symphony. You should be able to break it down to very, very basic. I didn't go that granular, but my idea was to take, we have that very, very simple melody that we all listen to, you know, just unadorned. And so see, what was Robertson doing and how can we take away the different ornamentations that make it sound like that to see, you know, exactly what he's doing. And he's adding double stops, he's messing with the rhythm with some syncopations. One of my favorite variations, like I was telling Patrick earlier, is this one because he what I'll play in a second, but he makes it seem like he's doing so much. But when you take away just one thing, all you have is the basic melody. And I'll show you which variation I was referring to. And so what he's doing there is he has this open string, and if you took away this extra E, you literally have the melody just played in a higher position. But he adds that's it, and it makes this very delightful little melody, which I love. I love playing that little section so much. But you get an incredible variation. Another variation which I find interesting is where he kind of like plays with the melody a little bit. It's still very, very simple, but the way he draws out what we expect from the rhythm, it makes it a completely different variation. Instead of, he just draws that out with some syncopation. And so that was basically how I got all the variations. I just kind of like deconstructed it that way. It's like, okay, what is he doing to this melody? Is the melody still even kind of in our ear at all? And there's some variations where it's difficult to hear any kind of semblance of that melody, but then he'll usually come in with that very basic to bring you back to home base.
And must have been hours of listening to that over and over.
Yes, my family was not happy.
Well, it's well beyond my skill set. And I think that before we go any further, it might be helpful in deconstructing it and analyzing it if we had a sort of a crash course in fiddling, or we need a fiddler's primer. And I guess the first question might be the simplest, but it's one that I hear a lot, and that is, what is the difference between a fiddle and a violin?
Well, there's many answers. One is it has strings, and the other has strings. And the other common answer is about $5,000. Yeah. But there are some differences structurally. I'll start with the instrument itself. A lot of the times classical players, you'll see a black chin rest here. I took it off when I was learning like fiddling and just like how it would change the sound, and I actually found it more comfortable. So they usually don't have any kind of support here. And then I use what's called a shoulder rest for classical, and this kind of helps facilitate me going up and down the neck because there's support. You can hold, and so you can go and utilize the entire fingerboard. But a lot of fiddle players do not use one, and you'll see you're much more limited in how you can move across the violin because your arm is the one holding up the instrument. And so, I can't really hold it up. It kind of slips, and so then you're kind of limited where you can shift. And so it's interesting in Eck Robertson's, that's about as high as he usually gets when he goes into different positions. And again, a lot of fiddlers didn't. They usually stayed in this first position. But you see Eck getting about here. Another difference you'll see a lot is the actual bridge. And the bridge for violins usually has a little bit more of an arc like that. Fiddlers will also shave down their bridge so it's more a flat surface, and this helps utilize the double stops more, and sometimes even triple stops that you'll hear on certain fiddlers. But Eck Robertson was actually a luthier, which means like he constructed violins, he made them, and so he would always flatten out his bridge. That results in less action on the instrument, so that means it's flatter to the fingerboard, and it kind of helps produce that like drone and that sound that we characterized with old-time fiddling.
And even though there's not much difference between a fiddle and a violin, I mean, the differences are negligible, there are huge differences between a violinist and a fiddler, though, right? The way they approach the music?
Oh, absolutely. Fiddlers prefer definitely an oral tradition. I would say a lot of them like scoff, like, oh, we don't need to read sheet music. Whereas classical, it's like sheet music is your Bible. You play what is on the page. Whatever Mozart wrote, you play. And then the idea of improvisation or variations, changing the melody, you don't see it as much in classical. It's, again, you play what is on the page, whereas fiddling players, that's the whole idea is like, well, we made a variation that you didn't think of, so we're a better fiddler than you, and hence we're the world champion too, greatest fiddler alive, going on.
So violinists are into precision playing, but fiddlers have a lot more freedom to experiment, right? And that, I think, provides some insight into Robertson and his 13 variations.
Absolutely. A lot of the fiddlers used to play square dances and barn dances, too. And, I mean, if you think about it, that means you're playing that same melody over and over and over for however long these people want to dance. And so I feel like that just really facilitated this opportunity for people to kind of be creative and be like, okay, well, I'm sitting here playing this Sally Gooden. what can I do to make it more interesting? Because I'm going to be playing here, for 3-4 hours.
Well, you've already mentioned that this is a breakdown. Later on, we will hear 2 other different kinds of tunes that Eck Robertson played. And a breakdown is simply 2/4,
2/4, good for dancing, fast-paced, no heavy syncopation like we'll hear in a rag later on.
And we'll hear a waltz and a rag
Yes.
both later. And in terms of other elements, like you mentioned things like double stops, could you define or explain what those are?
A double stop is just 2 notes played at the same time. As opposed to just one note. And some fiddlers play 3. I can't do it as well, but.
And playing in position, you mentioned that. Can you talk a little bit more about that as well?
Absolutely. So classical violinists, they play in positions all the time. They'll go up the fingerboard all the way back down. For positions, Eck usually plays in what's called third, which would be this one. And that just means where the finger is going up in terms of the scale.
And how many positions are there? 14?
Yeah, but usually violinists, once you start getting up there, you sound like a pipsqueak. I'm just gonna say, no one really wants to hear that. So usually it usually stops around, I feel like that's usually where it still sounds nice, but not too squeaky. It's about 7th.
And ornamentation, you had focal ornamentation was one of the column headings in
Yeah.
your table.
Ornamentations are just kind of like grace notes, which are like a quick addition to a note. Just any kind of like accent adornments that make it a little more fun.
And they still use these techniques, right? This isn't confined only to old time fiddling, no.
You'll hear grace notes in classical as well. I feel like it's just the way the melody is that makes it sound so much different.
Or in modern country fiddling?
Yep, definitely.
Can you
You'll hear it in.
show us something?
Yeah. We hear a slide. We hear the little ornaments, the grace notes, double stops, and George Strait.
And syncopation yet?
Not in that particular song, but.
Can you explain what it is? And
Yeah.
maybe demonstrate?
It's just kind of like altering the melody a little bit, so it's kind of like off the beat. So I'll try to do it with maybe Turkey in the Straw.
Sure.
Instead of your normal. It just plays with the rhythmic aspect of it.
Do you have a favorite variation in Eck Robertson's Sally Gooden?
I do. It was the one I played earlier. I feel like it's so fun to play this one. That's two variations, but still, those are my favorite of those.
Well, there is a lot about the sessions that we actually don't know. Like, we don't know if they went there intentionally to audition for Victor, or if this was an afterthought of their trip there when they went to visit Littleton. We also don't know exactly who was playing lead on the duets and who was playing the harmony part, but you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, Patrick and I were talking about it. It's like Eck's character, we think he would be the one playing the primary melody, but I really think it might have been Gilliland. He was known for his very precise, loud playing, and when you hear these duets, you hear that hammer down melody, and it's like, okay, that's very precise. It goes in characteristic of his playing. I read an interview Eck did later in his life where he said he actually liked playing tenor fiddle with people because he liked playing around the melody because no one else could play around melodies like they, you know the story. But in a lot of the melodies, he actually starts with the higher position, and that was very characteristic of Eck. And so that's why I think Gilliland played the primary and Eck was the secondary fiddle. Also, going to that argument, Gilliland was the more seasoned player. I mean, he was in his 70s, Eck was in his 20s, as well as Gilliland had the contact at RCA, so it would just make more sense, I feel like, for him to be playing the primary.
And you'll notice he also gets top billing or first billing over Robertson, which Robertson probably didn't.
He probably did not like that,
Did
no.
not like, but bowing to the senior to age.
Yeah.
Well, will you play two different kinds of Eck Robertson's other tunes, the
Absolutely.
waltz?
I will play Amarillo Waltz that he claimed to have written. He did not. It was a 1900s operetta song. It's actually called Kiss Me Again. Kiss Me Again, yeah. And it was for this operetta called Mademoiselle Modeste. My French is terrible. And I think that Eck probably heard it when he was on the vaudeville circuit, because you didn't hear this song very often in Texas, but it was played a lot in Missouri contests. And it is vocals and piano, but Eck adapted it to playing on the violin. What's pretty funny is in some of the quotes, he was like, oh, I don't need a second, someone playing guitar or banjo with him. He's like, I've never met someone that can play as good with me. And it's like, well, you didn't even write the song. But Amarillo Waltz by Eck Robertson.
Having heard Eck Robertson's version, it's fantastic to be able to see your fingering and the bow strokes and visualize what he is doing on that particular recording.
I have to say, I struggle, especially with waltzes, and I think it's my classical upbringing. I like to make waltzes sound pretty. I love playing waltzes. Eck Robertson's is definitely more choppy, but that kind of goes to how his playing style was, definitely not having a shoulder rest, being hunched over, and just kind of like how he held his bow too, which facilitated this very choppy style of playing.
His adaptation of Kiss Me Again Waltz raises a question that I was curious about, and that is, Eck Robertson claimed throughout his life that he was a quote-unquote natural-born fiddler. He never took a lesson a day in his life and prided himself on that. But in your analysis, did you see any evidence that he may have actually had
I did. I was a little suspect on Natural Born Fiddler. Some people who might have come out of his mother playing the violin, but his father was a fiddler. His brothers were all musicians, fiddlers, banjo, guitar. His uncles were fiddlers. His dad played the fiddle until he quit to become a Carmelite preacher because they didn't believe in music in the church. And so just growing up around this music, I was like, okay, you have to have had some sort of lessons watching people. And that's kind of a stylistic of playing. When he was on the vaudeville circuit, in many of the interviews, he would mention that the classical violinist he came across told him he was the best at what he did, naturally. And but one name that I thought was interesting that he said he did know was Fritz Kreutzer. And this guy was an amazing violinist and composer, and the fact that Eck knew him, I was like, okay, I imagine y'all had some sort of playing classical and not. He was also a piano tuner and a luthier, and so that requires incredible skill to be able to tune pianos. He lived in Amarillo, Texas for quite a while, tuning pianos, and then being able to construct violins. That has to be a skill that some training I feel like would be required.
And you'll play one more tune for us?
Sure. I'll play a little bit different. This is a rag. It's called There's a Brown-Skinned Gal Down the Road Somewhere, and yes, Eck claims to have written it. Though we don't think he did it. I think it's another fiddler named Lefty Franklin. He had a brother, Major Franklin, and also an amazing fiddler. They all kind of knew each other in the Texas contest scene, so I'm sure that's where he learned how to play this tune.
And would Robertson have played those different kinds of tunes in different situations?
Absolutely. He would have played all of them in contests. When you play a contest, usually you play a breakdown, hoedown, you play a waltz, and like a rag, a reel, something that shows your different stylistics. But then he would also play kind of at rodeos with his family, often play those kinds of tunes. And then he was known for, again, playing the vaudeville shows. So I think he would have really played them kind of any situation, especially the tunes that he wrote himself, being prideful.
We actually have time for questions, because what would a crash course be without a question and answer session? So here's your opportunity to ask those questions about fiddling that you were too embarrassed to ask before, because you're among friends.
over. I mean, you hear these kinds of fiddle tunes from Ireland, from Scotland, and then they came across to America and then brought all those fiddle traditions and the dancing tradition over, and then it kind of expanded into the Appalachian style, the Texan style. Very, very region specific, I would say, once you get into the United States. Ozark has its own kind of style fiddling.
They do. And actually, both of the men were born in the Ozarks. One in Missouri. Gilliland was born in southwestern Missouri, and Robertson was born in northwestern Arkansas, but moved as children down into Texas, both of them, with their families. But in particular, it's the Texas contest style fiddling, right, which becomes its own thing.
Yeah, Texas contest style eventually kind of took over because it was very ornamented and highly stylized kind of playing with virtuosity, not just kind of the barn dance. They did, yes. Yeah, Henry Ford was known for his fiddle contest. But yeah, definitely they would have played a lot in the Texas style. I'm not sure if Robertson ever played in one of Ford's competitions. I don't think I've ever seen any documentation. I think mostly he stayed in like Texas and the Missouri area.
His friend J.B. Cranfield claimed that who he recorded with in 1929, Robertson, claimed that he flew up on Ford's private airplane to Detroit, to Dearborn, to perform for Ford, and it's probably like the world's greatest fiddler claim as well, so,
The only ones are of him playing as a duet, because he passed away very shortly after in Oklahoma. So I think if he had, lived longer, then yes, I think there definitely would have been solo recordings of him.
And that is probably one of the reasons why he doesn't get the credit that Robertson gets. There are no solo recordings by him.
But there are stories, that he won all the competitions. He was the president of the Fiddler Association, so he's a very, very well-respected fiddler. I think because they usually played with a guitar or a banjo, that the chordal structure would definitely be there. They would stick within their chord, and that's kind of how you kept the shape of the melody. But intonation-wise, that would be very different. And I think just the different variations, I kind of liken it to the game telephone. It's like in the oral tradition, it's like, okay, you learn this melody or this style from this one fiddler, then you take it home and you start messing with it. Well, it becomes different variations, adapted songs, and maybe that's why a lot of the time we hear songs, we're like, oh, we kind of know that, but that has like 5 different names, and that's very common in the fiddle tradition. And I think it kind of changed when we did finally have this recording, and so as people could listen to these variations over and over rather than trying to remember them, go home, make their own. And so I think that's, again, why Sally Gooden is so iconic even today with those variations, is people had something to reference to rather than their own memory.
Absolutely. The phonograph record becomes a permanent document, and you can listen to it over and over again and play along and learn the variations. And it also, gives other fiddlers in Texas the idea that they too can make recordings as well. And really, these 1922 sessions open up recording for Texans in the central part of Texas. So you have a whole group of them record over the next 5 or 6 years from the area, fiddlers.
And I think to add to that, even being able to have these records at home, they could slow them down. Mm-hmm. And so when you can slow it down, you can really hear the nuances of what the person's playing and learn, as Eck always said, he's at workout tunes, because you can take that time and really nuance everything. I love the history of contest because before there were rules in place, they would liken it to sporting events. People would be drinking, throwing beers. They would have their favorite fiddle player that they would holler along to. Back then, early contest, it was not how well you played, but how well you could entertain the audience. And so you had, Eck apparently was very good at that. He would apparently throw his fiddle up and do somersaults and all sorts of things, and he would always win because he could, transform the audience, and he would, play songs like "Listen to the Mockingbird," where it has a bird chirped in it. He would do some other ones that had stylized harmonies and vocals, And so as finally, I think Major Franklin was a fiddle player, and he was the one who was like, no, he lost to Eck, and he's like, man, he didn't beat me fiddling, he beat me out, he like out-whooped me. That's through his vocals. And so then they started putting more strict rules on contests, and so you couldn't do any flashy playing. Like I'm sure you've all heard Orange Blossom Special, that kind of like classic double shuffle that was banned from contests. So it really just became more of the skill and like what you could actually do. And so now we still have at the Grand Championship in Hyattsville. They didn't have any rules on how many times you could win it until Mark O'Connor came as a kid and won it like 4 times in a row in mandolin, guitar, and fiddle. And so finally they said after you win so many times, you have to be a judge. Alexander Eck Robertson. He was also in some, on some CDs, you'll see AC Robertson.
Yes, his name was Alexander Campbell, named for a famous, I don't know what denomination, preacher.
Camelite.
Camelite
Yeah.
preacher, and went by Eck, though. Sure, the group of, especially college students in the 1950s and 1960s who began to listen to this pre-war music, both country music and blues music, especially the anthology of American folk music was sort of a touchstone for them, and listening to these records that were re-released, they began to play in this style, and they sought out many of the recording artists who had performed on these records in the 1920s and 1930s. And Robertson was one of them. The New Lost City Ramblers, with Mike Seeger in particular, they went and interviewed Eck Robertson, and they also produced an album. The middle one there, the famous Cowboy Fiddler, they produced an album of his. I think they were recorded in 1964 at his home in Amarillo, and it came out in 1991.
Around that same time, you had a lot of like ethnomusicologists, that people that wanted to record folk music for the first time, like in the Appalachians. You had people bringing, recording devices. You had the Lomax archives, and they recorded a lot of fiddle tunes and everything that had never been really recorded before Eck. It's funny, Eck, till the day he died, said that he was gypped by RCA, Victor Records. He said he was like, they stole millions from me. So he actually lived, it was kind of sad. His wife left him. His son died in World War II. So he ended up in the Texas Panhandle in Amarillo, and he had a piano tuning store, and he worked as a luthier, but he definitely worked a lot to be able to live every day. And who knows, it might have been different if he had, if he had achieved his fame that he said he did, or if he received all the things that Victor apparently promised him.
Robertson more so than Gilliland. Gilliland was a justice of the peace and worked in various local county government positions. But Robertson, I suppose, made a run of it, or at least supplemented his income on the small town or small-time vaudeville stage with his wife, performing with his wife.
He also wanted to, that's why he liked to win the contest, because there was usually a cash prize, $50 to $200 if you won. I don't think so. I think they still are very much hearken to the fiddler that was most famous for them. So I think that keeps the localization of who was most well known. But the nice thing was with the recording is they got dispersed throughout the United States. So I feel like it's a good thing that everyone heard about them.
Yeah, and you had different kinds of styles. You had Georgia fiddlers now learning how to play Texas style, and people in the Ozarks learning how to play Georgia style, and New England style as well, not to forget them.
It was a sinful instrument in the Deep South. So it's actually some crazy stories about fiddle players that thought they were possessed by the devil, and so that they wanted to be good, they wanted to stop playing. There was one story I read about a man who literally chopped off his left fingers, like the nubs, just to try to stop playing. And so then he, eventually as he got older, he was like, well, I still want to play, so he ended up learning on the other side. But you would find houses, people didn't want to destroy their instruments, so in a lot of the older houses in the South, you'll find fiddles in the walls, and it was just to resist temptation of playing the fiddle.
When people got religion.
When people got religion, yeah. And then I think because it was also equated with dancing, barn dancing, and so that was also usually a sin as well.
And drinking.
Yeah, and then drinking. And
Let's not forget that.
Yeah. Again, it's going to come down to like the tune structure itself, but I don't know if you've ever heard Sammy Kershaw. That's kind of like a very Cajun style. It's, I want to say like messier. The Texas style is usually more ornamented. It's more of a showpiece, like they want to showcase all of their skills. Again, that's why the Texas contest kind of like took over. And then I would say definitely the northern regions, they have more of that Irish fiddling tradition just because of the people that came over. So I think it all depends on the ancestral lineage as well. It honestly depends what I'm trying to learn. Nowadays, there's so many transcription books that you could probably find like any tune you want. Especially on the internet too, people have transcribed a lot. But I think when I try to learn Eck stuff, I try to do it the authentic way of like listening and then figuring out what he's doing. It always helps knowing the basic melody because then you can always go back to that, and then that's kind of how I feel like you make it your own as well. Is you listen to what everyone else is doing, you figure out, okay, well, I like when they did that, I like when this person did that, and this, and then you mash it together, and you're like, okay, now I have my version. But just being classically trained, I learned better from sheet music, I'm a more visual person too for me, so if I can see some sort of transcription, listen to it, then I feel like I memorize it better.
Thank you for those great questions, and thank you all for joining us today. Will you join me one last time in thanking Laura Jane?